Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Donald C. Stewart and I'm here in the studio of Broadcasting Scotland. I will be joined by our guest for this evening, the Managing Director of European Merchants, Anthony Salamone. Anthony, delighted to have you with us and welcome.
Thank you, Donald.
So as we always do, we begin with our Ukrainian update on day 342 of the current conflict. Ukraine's Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, has said that Kyiv expects to receive 120 to 140 tanks in a first wave of deliveries from a coalition of 12 countries. The tank coalition now has 12 members. The United States will not provide the F-16 fighter jets that Ukraine has sought in its fight against Russia, Joe Biden confirmed on Monday. Volodymyr Zelensky's most senior advisor, Andriy Yermak, has suggested that Poland was willing to supply Ukraine with those F-16 fighters. President Zelensky has called for Western weapons to be supplied more quickly. Speaking in his nightly address, the Ukrainian president said that Russia was hoping to drag out the war and exhaust his country's ability to exist. The Kremlin warned the West's supply of further weapons to Ukraine would only lead to a significant escalation of the conflict. Russian forces continued attacks on positions across the front line near the eastern cities of Bakhmut and Donetsk. Moscow's troops have been pounding Bakhmut in the Donbass region for several months, but in recent days the invaders appeared to have opened up a new effort to gain ground around the village of Vuhledar, which is 30 miles southwest of Donetsk city. President Zelensky has said that the situation in Bakhmut and Vuhledar was very tough, with both areas and other parts of the Donetsk region under constant Russian attacks. And a Western official said in a briefing that military casualties on both sides in the war totaled around 200,000, with a similar number killed and wounded on either side. Ukraine's military and Russia's Wagner private military group are both claiming to have control in the area of Blahodetny, eastern Donetsk region. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg and Japan's Premier Fumio Kishida have pledged to strengthen ties, saying Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its growing military cooperation with China had created the most tense security environment since the Second World War. A Russian court has fined the streaming service Twitch the equivalent of £46,200 for failing to remove what it said were fakes about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine's foreign ministry criticised the president of Croatia, Zoran Milanovic, for saying Crimea would never return to Ukrainian control, describing his comment as unacceptable. Russia and Belarus have started a week-long session of staff training for the joint command of their regional grouping of forces, according to the Belarusian Defence Ministry. The Russian government has banned the domestic oil exporters and customs bodies from adhering to Western-imposed price caps on Russian crude. And UK Defence Minister Ben Wallace has said that the tanks which are being donated to the Ukraine will arrive on the front line this side of the summer. Anthony, if I can just ask, because I know that you have a particular interest in Europe, that this is a conflict that in my lifetime I never thought I would see, but of course there have been many conflicts in Europe before, some close to this particular region. In terms of the sort of geopolitical structure that's out there, what do you think this is going to end up looking like once we come to an end here? I presume once the Ukraine have managed to take the Russians out of their territory.
No, I completely agree that I think that most people in the European Union and beyond had thought that this kind of large-scale war between two separate sovereign states on the European continent was over. And of course, it's so regrettable that that was not the case as a consequence of decisions of the Russian government. You're right that this war will end one day, though it's very hard to say, or in fact impossible to say when. And given Ukraine's perfectly understandable and righteous commitment to defending itself and its territory, that it's hard to see the war ending in a way, unless Ukraine feels that it's been able to reclaim what it has lost in terms of territory. And I imagine that that also includes Crimea, speaking to what the Croatian president said. And it's impossible to predict the eventual outcome of a conflict that's ongoing. And I should say as well that, of course, one of the pillars of the Ukrainian government's foreign policy is to join the European Union, or to apply to join the European Union. As I imagine your viewers know, Ukraine was granted candidate country status by the EU last year. But it would be very difficult to undertake an EU accession process when it was unclear, first of all, if the war was still ongoing, and second of all, if it was unclear sort of where effective Ukrainian territory, in terms of what the Ukrainian government controlled, began and ended. The European Union is a legal order. It's based on a very clear degree of predictability, which in part helped to create, and it's not used to dealing with countries that are either in the EU or applying to join the EU, which are at war. And so there's, beyond when the conflict ends and the challenge of reconstruction, there, and also the fact that some member states are more receptive to Ukraine joining the EU than others. The aftermath of the conflict, whenever it ends, will be very complicated.
Indeed, and we go from something that is impossible to predict to a prediction today from the IMF that the British economy will be the poorest performing of all advanced economies. United Kingdom is projected to become the only major industrialised power to see its economy shrink in 2023. This comes after Liz Truss's short-lived time in office, which led to a growth downgrade from the International Monetary Fund. In recently published World Economic Outlook updates, the UK's economic output is predicted to fall from 4.1% in 2022 to a negative 0.6% in 2023. In comparison, growth in the euro area is projected to bottom out at 0.7% in 2023 before rising to 1.6% in 2024. The forecast by the IMF has blamed the negative effects of Brexit, the UK's rocketing inflation rates and high energy prices for the outcome of the report. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has focused on the need for enterprise, education, employment and everywhere to tackle this prediction. However, this is criticised by business leaders for lacking a concrete plan of action. IMF Economic Councillor Pierre-Olivier Gorichas has warned that 2023 will be quite challenging for the UK, as well as emphasising that reliance on natural gas, a shrinking workforce and higher mortgages will only hurt economic growth in the coming years. He also stressed the need to tackle the current cost of living crisis to heal the economy. SNP economy spokesperson, Stuart Hosey, said that Britain is sinking as a perfect storm of Tory economic incompetence and that Scotland needs a lifeboat of independence to escape the constant decline of the UK. Hosey went on to say that the only way for Scotland to escape the economic turmoil of Westminster control is by becoming an independent country. Anthony, do you get the feeling that there is a concrete plan of action out there for the British government to take us through this particular perfect storm, or are they still making it up as they go along?
Well, I'm not entirely convinced that the UK government has a very cogent plan for how to sort of regain economic growth and so forth. I think that, of course, this evening is the anniversary of the UK's formal departure from the European Union, the third anniversary. And I think that that's, beyond the fact of that itself, it's a useful reminder that, many people in the Westminster political system have, allowed themselves to live in a reality where the policy choices that they make don't seem to have consequences, or if they have consequences, they're happy to try to deny them. Brexit and many other decisions made by the UK government have produced negative consequences, including negative economic consequences. Earlier on, it was hard to distinguish sometimes whether they were as the result of the pandemic and lockdowns and so forth, or whether they were a consequence of Brexit. We're at or even people may say other factors, but we're at a point where the negative economic consequences of Brexit are beginning to materialize, and they're difficult, or if not impossible, to ignore. And of course, the same government is in power, or same party is in power in Westminster as at the time. So No, it's a manifestation of the real consequences which the UK is facing. So Brexit, yes, sure. Also, high borrowing costs for the UK government is a consequence of the way in which the sort of very brief, as you mentioned, Truss premiership executed itself or unexecuted itself, and energy costs, which, yes, of course, are contributed in part by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But they also, I think, reflect some structural challenges for the UK economy in those areas which the Chancellor cited in terms of education or health. So those would be long-term solutions, which, first of all, you're quite right, would require not just a good industrial strategy, but probably a much more sort of economic strategy. And they would take years, if not decades, depending how well they're executed, to work. And of course, we're at the point where people will be looking for relief now. And it's regrettable because, of course, the people who suffer the most as a consequence are those who can afford it the least. But much of what is materializing is not the product of external forces over which we had no control, but in large measure due to the UK government's decision both to leave the European Union, but also to leave it the way in which it did, and also the relationship that we now have between the UK and the EU, which is very minimal compared to EU membership. Basic trade agreement that mainly focuses on goods and doesn't provide much on services, even though the EU was and remains the most important trading partner for the UK. In that kind of environment, it's not very surprising that Brexit hasn't produced great economic benefits. In fact, the exact opposite.
I'm very interested in what you said there in terms about, the European Union is a major economic partner. Would we treat a major friend in the way that they are treating the European Union? And are they learning from their mistakes, or are they just constantly repeating them in terms of trying to find some kind of relationship?
It's hard to tell. I mean, we seem to go back and forth. So, I mean, under the Sunak administration, it seems that there are potentially greater efforts to try to find a solution on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which of course would be much needed. But otherwise, the whole Brexit project was founded on what I would consider to be an illusion that the UK's relationships with its European partners were not that important. It was far more important to sort of allegedly be free of the EU and to strike trade deals with countries on the other side of the world, even though the UK does around half of its trade or so with the rest of the European Union, and that would should be fairly obvious to anyone. So I'd like to think that the UK government is willing to try to build bridges in a sense with the EU institutions and member states, but I think there are challenges to that. One is that many member states, in particular, Brexit was a personal thing, as in Brexit represented a rejection of the European Union, a rejection of the principles and values of the EU, which many national leaders hold very dear for obvious reasons. And in effect, the UK government was saying that we don't believe in those principles anymore. We don't believe in those values, and it's hard to sort of rebuild a new relationship with someone when they're in those completely different spheres of existence. There's that. There's, of course, the way in which the UK government has acted in terms of the previous sort of Northern Ireland bills and amendments and threats to sort of walk away from the Northern Ireland Protocol and so on. And of course, Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister, regardless of anyone's opinion on him in the UK, he was not respected in the EU. He was not taken seriously by most national leaders. And of course, that's a challenge if you're trying to mend fences and have a suitable relationship. So if you put all that together, I think that of course the EU would like the UK to be a stable partner, would like for the two to build on the trade and cooperation agreement and over time move the UK closer to the EU. But all of that is predicated on the UK government, on Westminster politics. And I think the EU is still waiting for that kind of reliable partner in that respect. Of course, I think the two sides have tried to find other ways to work together on other issues in terms of cooperation on supporting Ukraine, which is very commendable. But in terms of the political relationship between the EU and the UK, it's difficult. And of course, the EU didn't start Brexit, so it's over to the UK government to try to step up in terms of rebuilding links.
Indeed. And Anthony, I just want to pick up on the sort of Jeremy Hunt's, and you mentioned about the infrastructure, which I think is very, very important in order to build back into some kind of stable economy, some kind of stability that people can respect. These are long-term short-term headlines, long-term projects, which are not necessarily going to bring us any kind of benefits until much further down the road. And I suppose that even at it's the most obscure, that somebody might suggest that this investment is eventually going to pay dividends, but right now it doesn't help you pay your bill for gas and electricity. And so that the infrastructure suddenly becomes so important because we need it to build back.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think that, I suppose the UK wasn't the only state to underinvest in its infrastructure, but obviously the UK has certainly done it to a significant extent. So, first of all, if you want to sort of upgrade, that takes time. And yes, the economic benefits of sort of infrastructure renewal can, yes, also take years, if not decades, depending on the scale and the scope of the projects. So these are not quick fixes. And they're not going to provide people immediate relief in terms of higher prices or inflation or energy prices and so forth. They may be necessary decisions, and it may be beneficial if the UK government is wanting to invest more in infrastructure, but it's not going to solve any of our immediate economic concerns.
And we go from the whole fiasco around the economy into today being the third anniversary of Brexit. And on today, a majority in the rest of the United Kingdom now agree with Scotland that Brexit has been bad for the UK. And Guy Hans, a leading city figure and former Tory donor, has called Brexit a complete disaster and a bunch of total lies that has harmed large parts of the economy. Mr. Hans' remarks came as polling expert John Curtis said that on average, polls now suggest that 57% of people in the UK would vote to rejoin the European Union, with polling in Scotland at around 72% in support of Scotland rejoining. On the third anniversary of Brexit, the Scottish Government's External Affairs Secretary, Angus Robertson, set out 5 key benefits of Scotland rejoining the European Union as an independent country. He said the UK was fundamentally on the wrong path, and rejoining the bloc as an independent country is the best future for Scotland. Rejoining the European Union could bring a host of benefits, and these included, according to Mr. Robertson, the status of being an equal partner instead of being subject to Westminster control, being in the world's largest single market, 7 times larger than the United Kingdom, with reduced barriers to trade for Scottish businesses and a level playing field with businesses across the European Union. Regaining freedom of movement across the European Union, meaning people can live, visit, study, work and establish businesses in any European Union member state, benefiting from guaranteed minimum working conditions and standards in the workplace in Scotland and throughout the European Union, in stark contrast to proposed Westminster laws. Accessing a larger labour market, enabling businesses to tackle shortages in key sectors. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn MP said, "The past 3 years show Brexit has been an unmitigated disaster for the United Kingdom economy, public services and cost of living. It has cost billions, reduced trade, squeezed growth, hammered household incomes and provided none of the so-called benefits that were promised." With the Tories and pro-Brexit Labour Party ruling out any return to the European Union or the world's biggest single market, there's no route back to Europe under Westminster control. Independence is now the only way for Scotland to escape Brexit decline and regain our place in Europe. Anthony, you alluded earlier on that it is the third anniversary of us leaving the European Union, of Brexit. And I suppose the one question that I don't want to go into is how bad is it? Because I think that we just find ourselves in a fairly miserable place. But I think one of the things that I think would be interesting to explore is how can we improve our relationship with Europe in order to ensure not that Brexit works, but there may well be a dialogue that could eventually see Scotland at least returning to the fold in the European markets.
Yes, no, I agree with that very much. I think that we're in a place where perhaps unsurprisingly, I obviously was never a supporter of Brexit, as most, if not all, of the viewers are. But we're in a place where Brexit happened 3 years ago. Now, of course, the EU and the UK, and that includes Scotland at this stage, that there is a relationship through the trade cooperation agreement. It's a minimal relationship. It potentially it may be built on in the future and so on. But we have to face the fact that Brexit happened, that we're no longer part of the EU. And whatever happens in the future, there are still things that Scotland or the UK, if it wanted to, could do to try to maintain links with the EU. I think to me that's very important. It's important to focus on that because it's there, at least there used to be a pro-EU consensus in Scottish politics. It may have frayed, over the intervening years. But I think most people in Scotland and most people in Scottish politics think that it's right and normal for Scotland, or of course the UK as well, to have a normal, productive, positive relationship with the rest of Europe, and that's mainly through the European Union. So yes, I mean I've done a lot of research and writing on what I would recommend, and I think the most important thing for the Scottish government is to have a very clear strategy of how it's going to engage with the EU, because in this kind of environment it could be quite challenging, not least because Scotland is not an independent state at this point. Scotland is not part of the EU or part of the economic area, and the Scottish government has relatively limited resources in terms of the number of personnel dedicated to European international relations. There's all of that, but at the same time, who and what are you engaging with and why? The EU is a very large multinational organization, has 27 member states, has a variety of institutions in Brussels and elsewhere. It has a very busy policy agenda. It's not possible for the Scottish government to engage with everyone, to follow every issue in Brussels, to have a close relationship with every member state. You need to prioritize. What is most important for Scotland's values and interests at this point in the years ahead. Who are the key partners for not just the Scottish government, but wider Scotland, both in terms of member states in some cases, but also sub-state governments and other potential partners. All of that needs to be sort of set out in front. And if you don't have that, I think the risk is that, first of all, there's drift between Scotland and the EU, which happens as a consequence of Brexit divergence, or just the passage of time. And secondly, if you don't have those kinds of priorities, and needless to say, if Scotland were an independent state in the EU, would also need those kinds of priorities too. It becomes, you may have a lot of meetings and engagements with European officials, but if it's not in the service of a wider strategic objective, then you may not accomplish as much as you otherwise would.
And I think that one of the things you alluded to, that the way that Boris Johnson was seen across in Europe was less than complimentary, less than flattering. How important is it that in any kind of negotiation with Europe that we are seen as being trustworthy, that we are an equal partner, irrespective of whether it's the British government, the Scottish government, or whomsoever?
Yes, so of course the relationships are always crucial in negotiations or discussions. I think that beyond personalities, the most important element from the EU side is evidence that, be it Scottish or UK sort of interlocutors, understand the European Union practice. It's very and also perhaps maybe some evidence of the values of the EU, which is not to say that the EU is perfect. Of course, it's not. But I think that many people, many participants, both in Scottish politics and wider British politics, regrettably do not have that level of foundation on the details of how the EU functions. And what I mean is how the EU institutions work, what their powers and functions are, what are the sort of politics and issues of the day, but not just in Brussels, but in national capitals, the extent to which political leaders speak other European languages, that they follow the policy agenda in Brussels, and that they are engaged on the strategic debates that the EU has on its future, from the future of enlargement to the relationship between the EU and the United States, the relationship between EU and China, or whatever, all the other things that drive the day in Brussels. To what extent that first of all we are connected to that, and that EU leaders or EU officials can see that we are, and that we have something interesting to say about them. Because otherwise, meetings can be rather boring. Because the basis of any productive bilateral or multilateral relationship is that all the parties feel that they're gaining something from it. Now, Scotland has a lot to offer across a wide variety of areas in terms of expertise or skills in whatever higher education, renewable energy, just transition, climate change, and so on. You need to gather that all together and present it in a way that is interesting to partners in the European Union to facilitate the kind of engagement that will allow Scotland to have maintain links with the EU over the years ahead.
And I think if the politicians have that under the belt and they're ready to have that type of negotiation and also be prepared and willing to re-engage with the way in which the European works, is there a feeling that business would be ready for that? Because, of course, one of the things that is a major criticism of Brexit is that suddenly there has been a tsunami of form filling, of bureaucracy, of red tape, all of those things that I suppose in a sense that people were promised were going to disappear, a bonfire not of the vanities, but a bonfire of all of the form filling and the triplicate things that they believed were barriers to trade.
Well, I think it was inevitable once the UK government decided that it wanted to have a minimal bare bones relationship with the EU that these kinds of trade barriers would emerge. Because if you want to, have good access to the single market or even participate in the single market, it's perhaps not surprised that the EU expects whoever is doing that to, follow EU rules and standards, or in certain cases, sort of follow to the jurisdiction of the EU Court of Justice, where EU law applies. These are areas which Boris Johnson particularly did not want, and so therefore the relationship between the EU and the UK is worse in trade perspective. If the UK wanted to have a closer economic relationship with the EU, we would have to follow more EU rules, in short. And I don't know whether or not a future UK government would be willing to do that. But that's the only way to sort of incrementally or in a leap reduce sort of trade barriers between the EU and the UK, because if you're not part of the single market, then of course you have to there are barriers. That can't be avoided. The only way to try to forge a better relationship in that sense is for the UK government to be willing to integrate more into the EU in the sense of accepting EU rules and standards. And of course, the challenge in that is that the UK wouldn't have any say over those rules, but of course it did when it was a member state. And again, all these things are logical. I know that some businesses may be frustrated by the to and fro and the different rhetoric and so on, but at the end of the day, the single market belongs to the EU, not to the UK. And it's fairly obvious that the EU sets the rules of its own single market. If you want to participate in, you have to follow them. And that was obvious before Brexit, and it's still true now.
And I think as well that one of the things that the economy will always be that banner headline that people will want to see in the front page and that we're doing well and so on. But there are cultural links, massive cultural links. And I speak as somebody who benefited from that because I have visited Finland, Estonia, and even managed to Croatia and down to Kosovo as part of European exchanges in order to have the opportunity to change my view, exchange my view, have it challenged, have the discussion. And it made a massive difference to my own practice. And I hope in some way made a difference to the people that I was working with. Because certainly that lack of it, it's not just Erasmus, it's other things that were principal in university and college collaboration, educational collaboration, which we have lost, that I think is really important in terms of having us plugged into a cultural movement rather than unplugged from the rest of humanity.
Yes, I agree very much. I mean, I've always tried to respect people's opinions when they say that they supported Brexit, and of course there are different reasons for why people might have wanted to support Brexit. But I've always found them difficult because for me, the European Union is of course not perfect, but it is a project of European unity. It's one which is designed to create a different kind of Europe from the one that we used to have for centuries of violence and conflict and war, which we had both on the European continent, with which we also exported to other parts of the world. And it is a peace project. It has an economic foundation to it, but it was always a political project and still is, about bringing countries and peoples closer together in Europe. And yes, there's a single market and the customs union and so on, but equally important are avenues for cooperation, exchange, and partnerships and friendships, which have brought people in the EU closer together. That was the intent. That was the design, to forge something new and hopefully better. And it's hard to accept that people in the UK, or enough people in the UK, don't believe in that, or didn't believe in that.
And of course, the Brexit led to a number of opinionated politicians in the continent feeling that they had the opportunity of pushing their own agenda within the fairly right-wing sort of policy area. And we've seen those rises in Italy and Sweden and Hungary and Poland and also in Holland, where populist movements have ridden the sort of wave of anti-European feeling, but they seem to now be on the wane. There seems to be, although obviously in Sweden and Italy and Poland and Hungary, they are in some form of government post and so on, or leading the country. But there does seem to be an acceptance that, particularly from the war in Ukraine, actually being in this big club has major advantages in terms of maintaining European security and peace.
Yes. Yes, I mean, the far right has not gone away for sure, but I think that even they could look and see what happened with Brexit, or how Brexit turned out, and realize that that wasn't going to inspire people to vote for them in their own countries. Which is to say that, yes, the far right parties and populist parties exist in many European countries, and as you mentioned, they are in power in a number of European countries, notably in Italy. But most of them have backpedaled on the idea of leaving the EU, or indeed for countries that are in the Eurozone, of leaving the euro. So I'm sure they would still call themselves Eurosceptic, and they like to criticize Brussels, and frankly, many political parties like to criticize Brussels. But they've definitely toned down the idea of their countries leaving the EU. Sure, in part a consequence of the Ukraine war, but also having seen how disastrous Brexit was in every respect, not just of the economic consequences for the UK, but the sort of chaotic manner in which the UK tried to execute Brexit, and no one would want to repeat that for themselves. So the UK perhaps helped helped stabilize the EU in that sense by killing off the prospect of other members leaving.
That's a wonderful, ironic phrase, the way in which the UK government executed Brexit. And I suppose one of the executions that they have been principally focused in on is the removal of some of the safeguards that exist, particularly in terms of minimum working conditions and standards. Mm-hmm. And we are seeing the Westminster government looking gung-ho in terms of trying to change the way in which industrial relations are seen in this country, because they feel enabled where the least powerful within the United Kingdom are going to be their prey. And I suppose that in many ways, one of the fallacies, I think it was described as a lie earlier on in the report, was that we were going to take back control, we were going to make sure that all of these minimum standards and all the rest of it were enshrined in our law and everything was fine. Then along comes Jacob Rees-Mogg, a man with more words than sense, and what he wanted to do was to grab all of these and do the bonfire I've referred to earlier as a bonfire of red tape, get rid of all this, and suddenly people are sitting up and going, wait a minute, these are things that are very dear to us and make our communities and our society exactly what it is and what we want it to be.
Yes, this sort of so-called red tape, it usually means regulations which are designed to help or protect people or the environment or something else which matters to us. I think the European Union is in many senses is a stabilizing force for member states, because of course in most European countries at some point there might be a party in power which wants to do things that seem a bit crazy, but being part of the EU and being part of common rules and standards sort of smooths that out and sort of prevents parties oftentimes from acting excessively irrationally. And of course, the UK is not part of that anymore. Doesn't have those kinds of safeguards of European law, which of course the UK contributed to making, or indeed, the system of the European courts either. And in that context, yes, the UK government is free to pursue a deregulatory agenda within the limits of the UK constitutional system. And of course, that is a Westminster parliamentary system, which Parliament is ostensibly sovereign, but in many practical respects delegates extensively to the government. It's not a surprise, I suppose, because many of the people who drove the Brexit movement always wanted to take these kinds of steps. They always wanted to use Brexit as an opportunity to deregulate. And that was, I think, in large part driven out of their own ideology, even though that's out of step with public opinion.
And moving into the United Kingdom from Europe, the UK has fallen down the index of global corruption following recent scandals. And I know that, Anthony, that you described the European Union as being not perfect and they've had their own recent scandal. But in Britain, we have fallen sharply down the Global Corruption League table after a report warned of woeful inadequacies in upholding political integrity. The United Kingdom has fallen 7 places to 18th on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, representing the biggest fall amongst the G7 countries. The report was published 2 days after Rishi Sunak sacked the Conservative Party chair Nadhim Zahawi after revelations over his tax affairs, including that he paid a penalty to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. The United Kingdom's reputation has been damaged by a string of political scandals amongst the Conservative Party. The country had 3 prime ministers in 2022, with Boris Johnson departing after Partygate, as well as scandals, including the conduct of Tory MP Chris Pincher. The report said there was a growing list of problems in the United Kingdom, and it cited the awarding of lucrative contracts for protective equipment to people with connections to the Conservatives, including Tory peer Michelle Mone. It also highlighted the appointment of politically connected people to public sector roles during the pandemic. SNP MP Kirsty Blackman commented, "Tory sleaze and corruption is endemic at Westminster. Every iteration of this UK government has been mired in scandal from the get-go. That is why Scotland must escape and become an independent country. From dodgy COVID contracts, Partygate, and now the ongoing Zahawi saga, and Boris Johnson's murky personal finances, the Tories are up to their neck in it, focusing too much on their own self-imposed internal problems and not enough on the issues facing ordinary people." Anthony, I referred there to a recent scandal without any detail in the European Union. Of course, it was a vice chair of the European Parliament who had to resign and has been arrested. But it's very disconcerting at times that these headlines tend to besmirch the institutions and cause trouble for them as organisations, as well as the individuals who are there as elected representatives. And one has to wonder if there is anything left that this particular British government could do that has not already been done or exposed to make it feel unfit to govern.
Well, I think when it comes to issues of corruption, it highlights that the way in which the UK works in terms of a state, I think this is also the case of other countries, including the United States, relies a lot on convention as opposed to rules and enforceable standards. When you have parliamentary or government conventions, which people are supposed to follow, but they don't necessarily have, obligations or enforcement or penalties or so on, that, it can enable people who are less ethically minded to take advantage of the system. And I said we saw that in the United States as well during the Trump administration, where people thought that a lot of the constitutional safeguards that existed in the United States, they found out that many of those safeguards were in fact conventions which could be discarded, and no one knew what to do. So I think the UK is in that similar place. I guess the challenge is that once the kind of corruption is seen by the public, it's extremely hard to rebuild trust in institutions. And of course, trust in institutions is essential for a state to function. It's a significant problem, which is facing the UK government and perhaps others too. But it's one where it's not going to be easy at any point to rebuild confidence, and some people may never have confidence in the UK government, which I imagine might be the case for some viewers here. So no, it's a problem. But regardless of how long Scotland is or isn't part of the UK, it's right that people should be held to account for what they do or don't do in office, and there should be standards and they should be followed. and if people don't follow those standards, there should be consequences. And it's in Scotland's interest that the UK is able to govern in a functional way, regardless of how the independence debate evolves. And so I think it's in everyone's interest that the UK government regains some credibility, at least in terms of rules and standards being applied equally to people in Westminster politics.
Indeed, and we go from one less ethically minded topic to another as the New York District Attorney revives an investigation into Trump's hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. Prosecutors are to present a grand jury with evidence about hush money payments made by the former president to the adult film actor and producer Stormy Daniels during the 2016 election campaign. In a surprise move by Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney in New York, it revives a long-running investigation that appeared to be drifting and raises the threat of criminal charges, adding to Trump's already daunting legal troubles. The report from the New York Times newspaper came 2 days after the ex-president became the first candidate to hit the 2024 election campaign trail, delivering speeches in the early primary states of New Hampshire and South Carolina. Daniels, who was born Stephanie Clifford but professes to prefer her stage name, claims to have had sex with Trump in Nevada in 2006, when he was already married to Melania Trump. He denied the allegation, but in 2016, his longtime fixer, Michael Cohen, made a $130,000 hush money payment to Daniels, which Trump reimbursed. Cohen later pleaded guilty to federal campaign finance violations linked to his role in the hush money payment and alleged that it was made in coordination with and at the direction of Trump. Cohen, who spent time in prison, recently disclosed that on the 17th of January, he met Manhattan prosecutors investigating the matter. The New York Times also reported that witness David Pecker, former publisher of the National Enquirer, a tabloid that helped broker the deal with Daniels, was seen entering a building in Lower Manhattan where the grand jury has been impaneled. Prosecutors have also attempted to interview the Enquirer's former editor, Dylan Howard, two employees at Trump's company, Jeffrey McConney and Deborah Tarasoff, and officials at Trump's 2016 election campaign, the paper added. They have subpoenaed relevant phone records and other documents. Anthony, Trump as a phenomenon, I had to pick my words very carefully there, is something that we in the West have had now for so long to deal with. We are 6 years away from his election, probably 8 to 10 years away from when political rumblings began. Is there a point at which it's just too much for the American people to stomach and he will be banished into the wilderness? Or has he convinced enough people in America, do you think, that you shouldn't listen to fake news? Because his grand sweeping statement that the media at the front will tell you all the lies, the people who are going to hold my feet to the fire, if you don't believe them, then you'll only believe me. Mm-hmm. Will it ever happen that they wake up and smell the tan-coloured coffee?
I imagine there will always be a core of people who will believe Donald Trump, and of course that's because they want to believe Donald Trump. You know, the sort of the disillusionment that led to their support for Trump was long running. I think it's been brewing for decades, and rooted in the failure of American institutions to deliver and gridlock a Congress, through to the fact that many of these people, many Americans, are predisposed to conspiracy theories. They wanted to believe that there's some master puppeteer controlling things, perhaps that lets them feel that there is some certainty and order to their lives which doesn't already exist, or in fact doesn't exist. But like, the question is, how big is that core? I think that, you know, obviously Democrats don't support Trump, and I think many independents, which of course is one of the reasons why Joe Biden won at the last election, also are not persuaded by Donald Trump. So therefore we're speaking mostly about people within the Republican Party. I think it's very clear that Republican leaders are less enthusiastic about Trump as a candidate. You know, they may sort of say publicly that they support his previous tenure in office or some of his policies. And of course, why is that shift happens because he's not winning. The candidates that he endorsed in the midterm elections, the vast majority of them did not win. And not to be cynical, but the reason why most Republican leaders backed Trump in the first place is once they realized that he was a vote winner, and now in large measure he's not. So I think it would be perhaps certainly may not be much of a challenge for Trump to win the nomination for his party, given his influence over the Republican Party. But when it comes to a general election, I think that if you combine Democratic voters with independent voters, I think it's certainly a challenge for Trump to try to win a second time.
Moving from challenges in America to the news today of a suspicious death of a Rwandan journalist, prompting calls for investigation. Calls are growing for an investigation into the apparent accidental death 2 weeks ago of a prominent Rwandan journalist and government critic. John Williams Natwali, a regular critic of the authorities, was found dead on the 18th of January, and according to reported police accounts, he was killed when a speeding vehicle rammed a motorcycle in which he was riding pillion in the capital, Kigali. A US Senate committee said he had been silenced. Human rights organisations have joined other activists in raising doubts about the cause of the death of the 44-year-old editor of the Chronicles newspaper. Amnesty International and the Committee to Protect Journalists, an independent NGO based in New York, are among media and rights organisations calling for an independent investigation. 2 weeks after the alleged accident, Rwandan authorities have failed to provide a police report, the exact location of the alleged incident, any photo or video evidence, or detailed information on the others involved in it, a network of press associations and civil society organisations said in a joint statement issued today. Signed by more than 60 organisations, the statement said Ntwali was regularly threatened and attacked in pro-government media for his investigative reporting, and called on Rwanda's international partners, including the Commonwealth, to stand by their stated commitment to media freedom and to call on Rwanda to allow an effective, independent and prompt investigation into his death. Anthony, it's tough times for journalists. We see them, of course, reporting from Kyiv and reporting from Ukraine, and we have seen very brave people in Iran attempt to get some of the footage out of what is happening there. Adnan Khashoggi and what happened to him when he was in a Saudi embassy. These do feel rather dangerous times, and given that, for example, Trump, going back there to a more trivial part of it all, suggested that the media were not to be trusted. This is tough times if you have a pen and a keyboard and you're attempting to bring down something that's corrupt.
Yes, I think, on the one hand, journalism has never been more important because it presents a window to what's happening in the world. And it's much easier for more people to see that through the internet and social media and so forth. So, of course, governments or other actors who don't want those stories told, yes, will be motivated to act maliciously. That's one part. And the other part is what you mentioned, is an erosion of democratic norms and standards, which is just to respect journalism as a profession and ensure the safety of journalists in conflict zones or even non-conflict zones. If you start to degrade journalism as a profession and journalists individually, as Trump has done, because he doesn't like what they're saying, then that creates a culture or environment in which, both in the United States and in other parts of the world, journalists are more at risk, and that has serious consequences for democracy and for society more broadly.
And I think, heaven forfend that we would ever send anybody out to Rwanda on behalf of the British government, perhaps those who are most vulnerable and seeking some form of asylum. But, it's a dangerous part of the world, it would appear, particularly if you are fostering any kind of dissent. But I suppose the other element of this that I find quite interesting is, in terms of international responses to it, that where, if we are part of a larger movement, for example, a European movement, a union of countries that internationally we would have more influence in terms of getting a view across that would have perhaps a greater benefit to those who are vulnerable within those types of societies.
I mean, it's always better when countries sort of unite behind a common position, which expresses a shared value. I think that's always the case. Foreign policy is a challenging area for the European historically, because even though the member states of the European Union are deeply integrated into each other, they still nominally conduct their own foreign policies. The EU itself has a foreign policy, but there are also the individual foreign policies of the 27 member states. And it's an area where there have been developments, and of course, since the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009, the EU has a foreign policy chief, the sort of high representative of the EU, and through the European External Action Service, and it is active on sort of projecting the EU's values, as it were. But when you get into specific cases or circumstances with countries, it can the balance that politicians or diplomats strike between promoting ostensible values and also trying to protect their own interests, can be murky and sometimes distasteful. So, I think that on the surface level, of course, the EU collectively and also all the member states individually will be usually quite forthright in making pronouncements about European values and so forth. But when it comes to the practice, sometimes it can be a bit more complicated. I suppose one example would be the way in which the migration issue took such a hold in European politics in terms of mass migration from sort of North Africa into Europe and so on, and there's and the way in which politicians in the EU responded, which is to sort of strengthen borders and make it easier to sort of return people to transit countries and so forth, doesn't always fit with the professed values of European integration. And I think that's the case for other places too, including the United States and of course the UK as well. So I suppose at the end of the day, there's only so much. There's those balances and conflicts, but at the end of the day, there's also only so much one country can do about something that happens in another country.
Indeed, and talking about the vulnerable, we move to an adult disability payment consultation that has been announced, with people being encouraged to share their views on how a Scottish Government disability benefit supports their mobility needs. The consultation on eligibility for the adult disability payment mobility element will gather evidence to feed into a wider independent review. Ministers committed to this review to ensure the payment meets people's needs now and in the future. The mobility element, one of two components to the payment, supports people who have difficulties moving around or planning and following journeys. Social Security Minister Ben McPherson said, "Adult disability payment was developed in close cooperation with disabled people as part of our commitment to ensure Scotland's social security system is delivered with dignity, fairness and respect. To anyone who receives adult disability payment or has views on how it is delivered, I would encourage you to respond to our consultation." And I am quite sure that if you go into the Scottish Government website, you will find how to do that, because that is it for this evening. I'm going to, first of all, thank Anthony very much for joining us tonight. I enjoyed very much everything we had to discuss.
Thank you, Donald.
And indeed, that is it for this evening. But before I go, I want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please can I ask you to consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. And in terms of having part of the discussion tonight and talking about the importance of journalism and the importance of independent journalism that can be trusted, if you wish to be part of a movement, then this is one way in which to make that happen. Also, if you're on social media and you have enjoyed tonight and you have enjoyed other programmes that we have put together, please make sure you go and tell everybody else. And so today When it's Fitboz deadline day, I shall go off to check if Albion Rovers' audacious bid to bring Ronaldo from the desert has paid off. But it's good night from me, and thank you for watching.